You're not a hero! You're just some old man in a costume! The words crashed through the midday clatter of Silver Diner like a slap. Plates clinked, forks paused mid-air, and every face in the room turned. Slowly, then all at once. The man being shouted at stood still, shoulders stooped, cap worn soft at the edges, olive jacket faded by time. His name tag read, Robert Wilcox, though few noticed it now. His hands, trembling but not weak, clutched a small wooden box, no bigger than a lunch tin. A sliver of purple ribbon peeked from the lid. A coffee cup rattled in a waitress's hand nearby. A boy at the window stopped chewing his fries. Overhead, the fan hummed a low, indifferent rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Across from him stood the manager, Kyle. Sharp-pressed shirt, jaw locked, voice raised for effect. His face was red, not from heat, but from entitlement. He jabbed a finger toward the door. I said, move it. You're holding up the line. Robert didn't speak, didn't argue. He only adjusted the box in his hands, as if to shield it from the noise. A hush began to settle, not silence, but tension, the kind that grows in the seconds before thunder. One of the pendant lights overhead flickered. From the glass front door, a shape was forming in the reflection. A pair of polished black shoes stepped over the threshold, quiet, but certain. Inside the diner, no one noticed yet. Kyle exhaled sharply. You think you're something just 'cause you wore a uniform 50 years ago? Get out of here before I call security. Robert's lips parted, not to defend, just to breathe, shallow and slow. No one moved to help him. Not yet. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Earlier that day, the morning sun filtered through a set of faded curtains, casting long golden bars across the kitchen floor. Dust danced in the quiet light. The house was still, the kind of stillness earned over decades, settled into the bones of every wooden frame and photograph on the wall. Robert Wilcox stood at the stove, stirring a small pan of eggs. The sizzling filled the silence like a memory. He wore the same olive drab shirt he had worn every Sunday for years, pressed the night before, just like he used to do in the barracks. His back was straight, his hands steady now, though marked with the creases of age and old effort. Behind him, a modest table sat with a single place setting. Coffee already poured. Toast browned, just right. A paper napkin folded in a precise square. On the far wall hung 3 framed photographs, all black and white. In one, a younger Robert stood shoulder to shoulder with a squad of men, mud on their faces, eyes weary but sharp. Another showed a woman in a patterned dress, smiling as if she'd just said something funny. The last was a folded flag, its triangular case catching the light like glass over water. Robert sat down, fork in hand, but didn't eat right away. He reached for a nearby drawer. Inside, a folded American flag, a bronze lighter, and a small wooden box, the same one now clutched in his hands at the diner. He opened it slowly. Inside, a medal rested against black velvet, a purple heart. The ribbon was worn at the corners, like it had been touched more times than worn. He looked at it for a long moment, as if listening to something silent and far away. Then he closed it gently. He rose from the table and walked to the hallway. A coat rack waited by the door. Robert took down his cap, smoothing the front with his thumb. He grabbed a wrapped package from the counter, a small envelope containing a locket. The name on the back was engraved, Maribel. Weeks ago, she had dropped it, helping him up from the snow when he collapsed outside the diner. He remembered her hands, cold, fast, kind. She had said she didn't need thanks, but Robert never left a kindness unpaid. He stepped outside, locking the door with a deliberate motion. On the porch, the morning air carried the scent of dry pine and exhaust. Somewhere a lawnmower started. The hum of suburban life carried on, indifferent and familiar. Across the street, a teenager jogged by with earbuds in. Robert waved. The boy didn't look. He walked slowly toward the bus stop, careful on the cracked pavement. A young mother crossed his path, pulling her child closer like a reflex. A bus hissed up to the curb. Robert raised a hand. The driver made eye contact, then pulled away. No horn, no apology, just gone. Robert stood still for a moment, adjusting his grip on the envelope. Then, with quiet resolve, he turned and walked. His destination wasn't far. He had made the trip before, but this morning, the air felt heavier. On his way past a convenience store, a group of teenagers loitered by the door. One of them, barely more than a boy, pointed at Robert's jacket. "Cool costume, Grandpa," he muttered. The others laughed. It wasn't cruel, not fully, just careless. Robert didn't respond. He just kept walking. Inside the diner, the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes began to reach his ears before he even opened the door. The bell above it would chime, like always, and then he would find Maribel, return what was lost, and go home. That was the plan. He stepped onto the sidewalk outside Silver Diner, took a breath, adjusted the box in one hand, the envelope in the other. He reached for the handle and stepped inside. The bell above the diner door chimed as Robert entered, its familiar note drowned by the morning bustle inside. Waitresses moved briskly between booths, coffee pots steaming in their hands. Silverware clinked against plates. The low hum of a classic radio station played beneath the chatter. Glenn Campbell or maybe Willie Nelson. It was hard to tell over the noise. Robert paused just inside, letting his eyes adjust to the change in light. The warmth of the sun gave way to the dull fluorescence of the diner's overhead fixtures. His boots scraped lightly against the checkered floor. No one greeted him. Not yet. Behind the counter, Kyle, the manager, stood with arms crossed and a clipboard in hand. He was speaking sharply to a dishwasher, eyes narrowed, voice loud enough to carry halfway through the room. His pressed shirt clung tightly at the collar, and a crooked name tag sat above his chest. Robert spotted Maribel near the back, taking an order from a family. He began to walk toward her, carefully weaving between occupied tables. He didn't notice Kyle watching him now. A glance, a frown, a slow shake of the head. He stopped at the counter, waiting patiently for a break in the flow. Kyle's voice came fast, impatient. "Can I help you?" Robert turned slightly, his voice quiet. "I came to return something. It's for one of your waitresses. Maribel." Kyle blinked slowly, unimpressed. "She's working." Robert nodded. "I'll wait, just a moment." Kyle looked down at his clipboard, then back up, sighing. "You can't just stand around. This isn't a museum." Robert raised the envelope. "She lost this, weeks ago. I found it in the snow." Kyle stepped around the counter now, lips tightening. "Sir, this is a place of business. You're in the way. If you've got lost and found, you can leave it at the front." Robert shook his head gently. "It's personal. I'd like to hand it to her directly." A few people nearby had started to glance over. A couple in the corner booth went quiet. The child from earlier watched over the rim of a milkshake glass. Kyle's voice rose. "I said, you can't stand here. You're holding up the line." Robert's expression didn't change. He simply placed the envelope down on the counter and steadied the small wooden box in his other hand. "I only need a minute." Kyle's face flushed. Whether from the inconvenience or the defiance, it wasn't clear. He stepped closer. "You know what your generation's problem is? You think the world owes you something." Robert didn't move. Behind him, the front door let in a sharp gust of wind. "I don't need anything," Robert said quietly. "I'm just trying to return what's not mine." Maribel had noticed the rising voices. She began moving toward them, threading between tables, order pad still in hand. Kyle didn't see her coming. "Look, old man," Kyle said, voice now sharp and carrying. "You're not a hero. You're just another crank in a jacket. I don't care what stories you tell your friends at the barber shop." Something inside the room shifted. The scraping of a fork, the intake of breath. Even the radio seemed quieter now. Robert didn't respond. He simply looked down, adjusting the metal box in his hand as though protecting it from the weight of Kyle's words. A busboy paused beside a coffee machine, watching. A woman by the window said softly, "He served. That's Sergeant Wilcox. He's in the paper every Veterans Day." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Yeah? And I bet he wants a discount too." Maribel arrived now, stepping between them. "Kyle," she said, voice trembling. "That's enough." Kyle turned to her, annoyed. "What? He's blocking the counter." She reached for the envelope. "He's here for me. That's mine." Kyle scoffed. "You dating him now or something?" Her eyes widened, stung by the words. Robert stepped back, saying nothing, just holding the box close to his chest, as if that could shield him from the noise. Kyle wasn't done. "I've had it with these sob stories. Purple Hearts, World War nostalgia. It's all just a way to feel important again." Robert looked down at the box in his hands, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, the metal caught the light. The deep violet of the ribbon, the profile etched into gold. Kyle's sneer didn't falter. "You buy that online?" Maribel gasped. A hand went to her mouth. The busboy set down his tray. A man in a booth stood slowly, hand at his side. Not clenched, not aggressive, but aware. The room had turned. No longer background. Now, an audience. Robert said nothing. His breath trembled. Then, behind him, a sound. A door chime. Boots on tile. Polished, heavy, deliberate. No one had seen him enter. But now, he was here. For a moment, no one in the diner moved. The air itself seemed to pause, thick with tension and disbelief. The chime of the door still echoed faintly in the corners, but all eyes remained fixed on the scene at the counter. On Robert Wilcox, standing silently, hands trembling around the open box, and on Kyle, arms crossed with a sneer frozen halfway between mockery and confusion. It wasn't until the sound of boots hitting tile broke through again, deep, deliberate, almost ceremonial, that heads slowly began to turn. The man approaching wore a deep green dress uniform that seemed to drink in the light. His shoulders were broad, chest lined with rows of ribbons and medals, shoes polished to a mirror gleam. He walked not quickly but with certainty, as though this was not a place he had arrived at, but one he had returned to with purpose. His presence shifted the gravity of the room, the way a mountain shifts a horizon. General Ross did not speak at first. He stopped beside Robert and looked down at the open medal case, the Purple Heart cradled in its velvet. Then his gaze rose to meet Kyle's, who now stood stunned, as if trying to compute whether this was a dream, or worse, a reckoning. A hush fell again. Dishes stopped clinking. Conversations died. Even the kitchen went still. Only the hum of the refrigeration unit dared continue. The general's voice, when it came, was not loud, but carried like steel wrapped in cloth. "Sergeant Wilcox." He didn't need to say more. Robert's eyes met his, and something passed between them, not recognition alone, but memory. Robert nodded, a faint smile twitching at the corner of his mouth, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken words. General Ross turned toward Kyle then, who instinctively stepped back, his usual bravado disarmed. "This man," Ross said slowly, his voice now filling the room like a bell, "carried his brothers through hell. I watched him pull wounded men from the mud while bullets cut the trees around us like paper. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for thanks. He did it because it was right." His eyes scanned the room. Because it was the honorable thing to do. A silence followed that felt almost holy. Ross took a breath, softer now. "I wasn't one of those men, not directly, but I saw him. I saw the way he held the line, the way he never flinched, never faltered. Watching Sergeant Wilcox taught me the kind of man I wanted to be." Kyle's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands, once planted firmly on his hips, now hovered awkwardly at his sides. Ross stepped forward, gently closing the box Robert still held, his hands deliberate and reverent. "There are fewer and fewer men like him left, and we are all lesser for everyone we forget." Across the diner, the mood shifted. A veteran near the door rose, hand raised in a slow salute. A woman near the window wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. The busboy, who had said nothing the entire time, placed a hand over his heart. Maribel stood silently beside Robert, her eyes glistening, and then, without a word, she placed the locket over her neck where it belonged. A quiet understanding passed among the patrons. Respect wasn't just owed, it had been long delayed. Kyle looked between them all, chest heaving slightly as if trying to find oxygen in a room that no longer allowed his kind of breath. I didn't know, he mumbled. Ross didn't flinch. You didn't care to know. The words landed like a verdict. For the first time since stepping inside, Robert straightened fully. His posture, though worn by time, now held a quiet pride. He looked around the room, not for approval, but simply to witness it. The truth, no longer hidden. The service no longer invisible, and for the first time in decades, a space that had once felt indifferent now felt like home. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the flag just outside the window. Inside, the world had changed. The medal had been returned to its box, but its weight lingered in Robert's hands. The room around him had grown quiet again, reverent now, but somewhere deeper, older, a memory had stirred. Not just in his mind, but in his bones, in the scar tissue, in the marrow of who he had become. And before anyone spoke again, the years began to fall away. It began with the sound, the dry crack of a branch snapping underfoot, followed by a low hum in the chest, like thunder rolling from far away. Then the heat returned, oppressive and wet, the kind that clung to skin and filled the nose with rot and copper. The jungle was alive with noise, insects screaming, choppers roaring overhead, the bark of commands half lost beneath gunfire. It was Vietnam, 1969. Robert crouched low in the brush, one hand gripping the stock of his rifle, the other shielding the face of a boy beside him, barely 18, eyes wide, chest heaving with fear. They had been ambushed on the trail. Radio silence. 2 wounded, maybe 3. The air was thick with smoke and cordite. The taste of blood clung to the back of the throat. It was hard to tell if it was his or someone else's. "Wilcox!" came a shout from somewhere to his left. "We've got men down near the ridge." He didn't wait for orders. He moved. The mud sucked at his boots like quicksand, every step a battle. Rounds snapped through the leaves above, too close. He dropped beside Corporal Martinez, who was bleeding from a leg torn open just below the knee. No time for comfort. Robert wrapped it with his belt, slung the man over his shoulders and stood, the strain pulling something deep in his side. He didn't scream. He just moved. 2 more men followed, covering his path. The ridge was steep, the footing unsure, but Robert climbed anyway. Dirt streaked across his face, rifle slung useless on his back. The jungle tore at him, vines wrapping like hands trying to drag him back into the underworld. But still, he climbed. At the top, mortar fire shook the earth. Ahead, Private Grayson, the youngest of the unit, froze behind a felled log, too scared to crawl forward. His helmet sat beside him, eyes locked on something Robert couldn't see. "Move!" Robert shouted. "You have to move!" The boy didn't. So Robert ran. He dropped Martinez at the edge of the clearing and bolted back, sliding beside the boy. A look passed between them, not of courage but of shared fear, of the understanding that they might not leave together. Robert nodded once, then grabbed him by the collar and dragged him into the brush. A round struck the tree behind them, splitting the bark with a sound like bone. They didn't stop. Not until the smoke thinned and the sound of friendly voices began to rise again. Later, much later, when the helicopters had lifted and the dust had settled, a medic asked Robert why he hadn't waited for backup. He had shrugged. They were breathing. He never told anyone what it felt like to carry that much weight. Not the men, but the silence after. The faces that didn't blink. The blood that didn't wash out for days. And now, standing in the diner, that memory pulsed in his hands like it had happened minutes ago. General Ross hadn't spoken again. He didn't need to. Robert's breathing steadied, the flash of jungle slowly fading back into tile floors, and soft jazz playing once more from the radio. The present had returned, but the past had left its mark, like smoke in a coat you can never quite wash out. No one in the diner moved at first. The memory still hung in the air, though unspoken. Something had shifted in Robert's posture, something ancient and unshakable. The silence wasn't hollow now, it was weighty, charged. And into that silence stepped General Ross, not as a superior officer or a man in uniform, but as a witness, someone who had carried the echo of Robert Wilcox with him across decades and continents. He turned slowly, facing the room, letting his voice rise. Not loud, but enough to command attention the way only those who have once shouted over chaos know how to do. "This man," Ross said again, pausing between the words as if laying stones across a river, "was the reason many of us made it home." He didn't look at Kyle. Not yet. He looked at the others, the couple by the window, the waitress frozen mid-step, the old man by the door who had been the first to salute. I was a junior officer when I met him. Still green, still afraid. I watched Sergeant Wilcox carry men through fire. I watched him take command when others fell. And I watched him do it without ever asking for a medal. The words hit the room like a slow tide. People looked at Robert now, really looked. No longer the hunched man with the old jacket. Now they saw the steadiness in his gaze, the quiet that wasn't frailty but discipline. The busboy, still wearing his apron, hands flecked with soap, stepped forward, stopping a few feet away. His voice came soft. "My uncle served in the Gulf. He told me about guys like you." Then, with an awkward, almost trembling hand, he raised 2 fingers to his brow and held them there. General Ross nodded once in approval, then turned his eyes to Kyle, who was now standing slightly behind the counter, as if the stainless steel offered some kind of shield. "You saw a man standing still," Ross said, tone cooling. "But you didn't stop to ask why he stood. You barked orders at someone who once crawled through mud to drag wounded soldiers out by the collar." Kyle tried to speak. His mouth opened, but nothing coherent came. His fingers tapped the edge of the register, nervously, like someone looking for an escape route in a windowless room. "I didn't know," Kyle managed. Ross stepped closer. "You didn't want to know." A voice from the far booth spoke next. An older man in a denim jacket, white hair curling out from under a faded Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. "He was with the 101st, wasn't he?" the man said. "That's the old Screaming Eagles patch on his sleeve." Robert, hearing the voice, turned slightly. He nodded once. The man's voice cracked. "My brother. He was in that unit. Never came home." Robert met his eyes. "I'm sorry." "No," the man said, shaking his head. "I'm not. Not anymore. Because someone like you was there. Makes it easier to believe he wasn't alone." Across the diner, the temperature had changed. Not just in tone, but in how people moved. Slower, gentler. Coffee cups were set down with care. Eyes met where before they had passed. Maribel stepped forward again, placing a hand on Robert's arm. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. Her voice was low, almost like a child's. Robert shook his head. "Wasn't for me to say. I was just a part of the line." A middle-aged man stood from his stool at the bar and turned toward Kyle. "You know," he said, voice dry but firm, "I come in here every morning. I've seen you push people like him aside before. Not this loud, but I've seen it." He turned toward the counter. "I think it's time this place changed." A murmur rippled through the room. Small nods, quiet affirmations. Kyle looked around, now fully aware that the room had turned against him, not in vengeance, but in awakening. He opened his mouth again, but no one waited for his explanation. Ross looked down at Robert, then addressed the room one last time. "This isn't about making a scene. It's about making a correction. About remembering the weight of what men like Sergeant Wilcox have carried, so we don't forget it in our rush to move forward." Robert adjusted his cap, eyes glistening, though he hadn't shed a single tear. And then, slowly, a sound began. Quiet at first. A single clap, then another, then silence again. And then, from the far end of the room, the veteran in the denim jacket rose to his feet, turned to face Robert fully, and brought his hand to his forehead in a long, steady salute. One by one, others followed. Not everyone, but enough to make it matter. A salute. A hand to a heart. a head bowed, each in their own way, the kind of recognition that cannot be bought, only earned. Robert didn't speak. He didn't have to, but something had shifted in his stance. Not taller, not prouder, just freer. Robert Wilcox had been saluted before, in places far from home, in years stained by smoke and dirt, but never like this. Never in a place so ordinary, a diner, a Tuesday. No anthem played, no marching band, just people, chairs scraping quietly across the floor, breaths caught in the chests of men and women who now saw him fully. He hadn't asked for it, not once. He had come to return something that wasn't his, a locket, a kindness repaid, and instead had been handed something rare, the truth made visible. The man in the denim jacket stood the longest. His salute didn't waver, not once. Near him, a young mother pulled her child into her lap and whispered something neither the child nor anyone else would ever forget. That man protected the world before you were born. Maribel stepped back, tears glinting just beneath the rim of her lashes. She didn't cry, not quite, but her fingers trembled as they brushed her apron. She placed the order pad down on the counter, quietly, and turned toward Kyle. "I think we've heard enough from you," she said. Not with venom, but finality. Kyle didn't argue. Couldn't. His voice, once so loud, now felt like a match against thunder. He stood awkwardly, halfway between flight and shame. No place left to hide in the crowd's quiet reverence. His jaw tightened, eyes lowered. He didn't speak again. The owner of the diner, a tall woman in her 60s with hair like steel wool and hands hardened by decades in a kitchen, stepped out from the back. She had watched it all. Her gaze moved from Robert to Ross to Kyle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Get your things," she said to Kyle. "You're done here." Kyle's head dropped. He hesitated only a moment before walking toward the back, eyes on the floor. No one followed him with words, only silence. General Ross turned to the woman and nodded. "Thank you." She returned the nod, then looked to Robert. "From this day forward," she said, her voice steady but warm, "this place will have a new sign at the door. Veterans welcome. It's not much, but it's real, and it's staying." Someone in the corner clapped once, softly, then again. And like rain tapping gently across a roof, others joined, not loud, not performative, but grateful, authentic. Robert didn't move at first. His cap sat low on his brow, the metal box now safely back in his coat pocket. Then, slowly, he reached up and adjusted the brim with practiced ease, the same motion he'd done 1,000 times in formation. He looked at Ross, and with a subtle nod, raised his right hand to his temple. The salute was returned. And then, in the quiet that followed, a sound filled the room more deeply than applause ever could. Silence. Complete and respectful, the kind that speaks louder than words. Outside the diner, the wind lifted the American flag hanging from the pole near the sidewalk. It unfurled gently, then held. A line of sunlight slipped through the window and landed across Robert's face, tracing the sharpness of his jaw and the calm behind his eyes. Inside, no one spoke. There was nothing left to say, only what had been restored. Not reputation, but recognition. Not pride, but peace. The kind that can only come when the unseen is finally seen. The day moved on, as days always do. Customers finished their coffee. Children asked for pie. The kitchen resumed its rhythm. But the weight of what had unfolded lingered like smoke after a ceremonial fire. People left the diner quieter than they'd entered, their steps more measured, their thoughts turned inward. A few nodded toward Robert as they passed him on the way out. Some paused to offer a thank you, others a small gesture, a hand to the chest, a soft salute, the squeeze of a shoulder. By the end of the lunch rush, the owner, Ms. Cora Ellis, who had run Silver Diner for 37 years, stood before the staff with her arms folded and her voice low but certain. "Starting tomorrow," she said, "we're making it official, a new policy. Veterans welcome, not just on signs, but in practice. Everyone who works here will get trained on what that means." She looked around the room, at the cook who had peeked out from the kitchen window during the incident, at the waitresses who now stood quieter than usual, and at Maribel, who nodded, eyes still red but proud. "That man came here to return something that didn't belong to him," Cora added, "and left behind something none of us will forget." The sign went up that same afternoon. Not flashy, just hand-lettered for now, in gold paint on blackboard. "Veterans welcome here, every day." Later that week, a permanent plaque would arrive, screwed into the brick beside the front door. It would read, "In honor of Sergeant Robert Wilcox, courage never grows old." The photo accompanying it showed Robert in profile, standing just outside the diner that very day, cap tipped back slightly, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Within a week, word of what had happened made its way to a local newspaper. Not through press releases, but from a customer who had been there that day and couldn't keep the story to themselves. The article was short but powerful, titled simply, "A Soldier Was Mocked, a Town Remembered." The story traveled further than anyone expected. It wasn't viral in the internet sense, but it touched the right hearts, especially those who'd once worn a uniform or waited for someone who did. Kyle was never mentioned by name. He had left quietly, and for many, that was enough. Some said they saw him a few days later, sitting on a bench across from the high school football field. A ceremony was taking place on the lawn, the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps performing their monthly salute. Kyle didn't speak, but watched the young cadets with a strange stillness, something unreadable etched into his features. A small replica medal sat in his palm, not real, not earned, but perhaps understood now in a way it hadn't been before. No one approached him. No one needed to. Redemption, if it was coming, would be his own to carry. Meanwhile, the diner began to change in quiet ways. A small flag was added near the register. A wall was set aside for photos. Local veterans, snapshots brought in by family members, black and white portraits from attics and old albums. Robert's photo was the first. By the end of the month, there were 42. Cora began offering coffee on the house to veterans, though she never advertised it. "Just say you're one," she'd say, "and we'll take it from there." But more important than the coffee were the conversations that followed. Strangers found common ground. Generations began to share stories across booths. A sense of weight returned to the air, not heavy, but grounded. Robert never asked for a seat at the center of it all, but his table, near the window, slowly became a quiet fixture. Not reserved, not labeled, just known. Some days he sat alone. Some days someone joined. And sometimes they just sat without words. What had started as an insult became something lasting, a ripple that touched more than just a moment. It became a correction in the bones of the place, a reminder that courage doesn't announce itself, that honor wears no uniform once the war is over. But when seen, truly seen, it changes everything. The sun was beginning to fall, painting the sky in long strokes of amber and rose as the last warmth of the day clung to the edges of the wooden porch. Robert Wilcox sat in his old rocking chair, the slats creaking gently beneath him, a glass of iced tea at his side, untouched but sweating in the summer air. He wore no jacket now, just a white shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, his cap resting on one knee. His boots, though still polished, were untied. The day's labor finally set down. The American flag at the corner of the yard swayed slightly, the breeze moving it not with force, but with reverence. It made a soft rustle, like whispers between the trees. From where he sat, Robert could see down the street, the old elm tree at the corner, the neighbor's sprinkler casting rainbows over dry grass, a young boy pedaling his bike in slow circles, legs just long enough to keep him balanced. It had been a long day, not in hours, but in memory. He didn't replay the confrontation. He didn't dwell on the manager's words. Those would fade. But the moment of silence, that room of strangers rising to their feet, the look in Ross's eyes, the salutes offered without command, that stayed. Not as noise, but as something gentler, like the low, steady heartbeat of a world beginning to remember. Robert leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. The chair rocked with him. He hadn't gone to the diner to be seen, hadn't worn the jacket for recognition. It was simply habit, a ritual of respect, for the ones who hadn't come home, for the weight he still carried, the ones whose names weren't on plaques, who didn't live long enough to hear the word "thank you" once more. But today, something had shifted, not just in a restaurant, but in the quiet arc of his life. He was not young anymore, but he was not invisible, not anymore. The screen door creaked behind him. A neighbor's cat slinked across the porch rail, pausing only briefly to acknowledge him with a blink. Robert watched it pass, then looked back out toward the west, where the sun had dropped low enough now that the sky turned lavender near the hills. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, he believed it. The world still remembered. Not everyone, not loudly, but enough. He settled back into the chair, hands resting lightly on the armrests, face lifted to the breeze. And in the silence of that golden evening, as the wind kissed the flag and the shadows lengthened gently across the yard, Robert Wilcox let himself rest. Not from age, but from carrying something too long alone. He didn't speak it aloud, but for the first time in years, he believed it. Honor still had a place. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.